It is around 150 BCE. A caravan enters the city just before sunrise. The gates open onto a crowded market in what is now Punjab. Camels loaded with cargo disappear into the streets. Traders unload baskets, scribes begin recording transactions, and soldiers weave through the growing crowds. A man reaches into his purse, pays for his goods, and walks away. The merchant glances at the silver coins for barely a second before dropping them into a wooden box filled with dozens of others. Nothing about the exchange seems unusual. Until we look more closely at one small detail on that very coin, one that would puzzle historians more than 2,000 years later. One face shows Athena, the Greek goddess of war, wearing a helmet and holding a spear. The other shows a wheel with 8 spokes, the Buddhist Wheel of the Law. The inscriptions run in 2 scripts, Greek down one side, on the other, Kharoshthi, the script used to write Prakrit, the everyday spoken language of the region, descended from the same linguistic roots as Vedic Sanskrit. Now, the king who minted this coin rules from a city called Sagala, near the banks of the Indus River. Yet, he is not from here, nor is he a conqueror from anywhere nearby. And to understand this political climate, one of the strangest the subcontinent may have ever experienced, we need to return to the moment when the greatest conquering machine the world had yet seen broke apart. In 326 BCE, Alexander the Great and his Macedon army crossed the Hindu Kush and reached the Indus, the eastern edge of the world the Greeks knew. There, he met the ruler the Greeks called Poros, a name likely drawn from Puru, or from the Sanskrit word and name Purushottam. He was the king of the ancient Indian kingdom in the northwest, called Paurav. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, Porus threw everything he had at the invaders: war elephants, massed infantry, a disciplined line. But even that would not be enough against the mighty Macedon army. Alexander won, but it would cost him. The fighting was brutal enough that when he tried to push on any further, his exhausted men refused. They had heard what waited beyond it: the Nanda Empire, with an army said to dwarf anything they had yet faced. And so, after doing what any emotionally balanced world conqueror would do, literally shutting himself in his tent for 3 days, hoping guilt would change his men's minds, Alexander finally gave in and they all turned back. 3 years later, in 323 BC, Alexander was no more. Felled in Babylon by what was believed to be an infectious fever, but the exact cause is still argued upon. His empire ended with him, but he left a long-lasting legacy. The Greeks never left. Almost overnight, the empire was carved up among Alexander's generals, the kingdoms we now call the Hellenistic world. The largest of them was the Seleucid Empire, which for decades stood as the regional superpower alongside Mauryan India. But it was vast and stretched far too thin to hold. And in around 250 BC, the governor, or satrap, of its far eastern provinces, a man named Diodotus, stopped answering to the Seleucids and broke away, founding the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. Bactria grew strong, and around 180 BC, its kings finally did what Alexander never could. They pushed south through the mountain passes into India proper. The lands they carved out there became a new realm, the Indo-Greek Kingdom. And, out of the long, messy succession struggles that followed, one general fought his way to the top. His name was Menander. And this is where the story gets interesting. But first, the obvious puzzle. How did a breakaway kingdom manage to conquer the very region Alexander's mighty army had refused to enter? The answer turns out to be tangled up with another question entirely. How a Greek king came to call himself a Buddhist. And to understand how the Greeks found an opening in India at all, we have to look at what had once made that impossible. The Mauryan Empire. At its height, the Mauryan Empire was enormous. It stretched across much of the subcontinent, including the northwest, where Alexander's successors still watched from beyond the mountains. Then came one of the empire's most influential rulers, who early on followed the same path expected of any great emperor of the time: expansion, conquest, and power. His name was Ashoka. And that path led him to the conquest of Kalinga, a prosperous kingdom on India's eastern coast. The war was a victory, but it was also a wound. The suffering was so great that it led to Ashoka becoming exactly what he no longer wished to be: a conqueror. And this is where Buddhism comes into play. Hinduism and Buddhism grew from the same ancient Indian world. They often moved side by side, sharing ideas about karma, rebirth, and self-discipline, even when they disagreed on the path. Most importantly, both valued non-violence. But Buddhism placed compassion at the very center. Hindu traditions also discouraged violence, but they allowed it when performed as duty, especially the duty of kings, men like Ashoka himself. So for Ashoka, Buddhism offered a way to remake himself. He could no longer erase Kalinga, but he could try to erase the identity of Ashoka the conqueror. So he turned to the faith. And since he was the ruler, most of his subjects followed suit. And as he embraced Buddhism, he supported monks, built monuments, sent missions, and spread Buddhist ideas far beyond the Ganges plain. Buddhism spread quickly. Part of its power was that it was not locked behind a priestly class. Anybody could practice it. But there was a political cost. Empires aren't really held together by compassion alone. As Ashoka turned the empire away from conquest, the machinery of the empire slowly lost its edge. It is not that the empire was weak. It still had armies strong enough to defend itself. But after his death, his successors were neither able to fully carry forward Ashoka's vision, nor return to the old model of conquest. Administrative strain, economic pressure, and overextension began to wear the empire down. And in the northwest, that weakening mattered, because beyond the mountains, the Greeks were still waiting. And in around 180 BCE, they did what even Alexander couldn't. They pushed south through the passes and into India proper. And once they found their footing, they did not just survive there, they thrived. For over 2 centuries, more than 30 different Greek-speaking kings ruled an empire at the crossroads of the world. They built Mediterranean-style cities with gymnasiums, amphitheaters, and stone columns in the middle of Asia. And this is where Menander comes from. He is an Indo-Greek, Greek by blood and language, Indian by the ground he stands on. And as these Greek rulers looked out over their new domains, they ran headfirst into the powerful, rising spiritual force that Ashoka had helped spread. Which brings us back to the coin. Why is it there, and why is it so unique? The answer sits in one of the strangest texts to survive from the ancient world. It is called the Milinda Panha, the Questions of Milinda, and Milinda is the Indian rendering of Menander himself. When Menander reached India, Buddhism there was too big for him to ignore. But the tradition says he did more than tolerate it. It says he questioned it, tested it, and finally, accepted it. Menander was a Greek warlord trained in conquest, but also shaped by the same Greek culture that was obsessed with philosophy and debate. He liked testing sages, cornering them with questions, and tearing apart their arguments. Until he met a Buddhist monk brilliant enough to answer him. Nagasena. He wanted a debate, but more than that, he wanted a trap, using the strict rules of Greek dialogue. And so, when Menander heard other monks speak of Nagasena, he knew exactly who he wanted to debate. Soon after, the two met. Now, not much survives of their exchange, except the famous analogy between a chariot and human life. Menander questions how karma can make sense if Buddhist teachings deny a permanent soul, since there shouldn't be any lasting self to experience the consequences. Nagasena answered politely by pointing to the king's chariot. He explained that if all its parts, the wheels, the axle, the frame, and the pole, were removed, there would be no chariot left. The point was that the chariot had never existed as one single permanent thing. It was only a name given to many parts working together. A person, Nagasena said, was the same. Now today, this might sound less like royal philosophy and more like a therapy session with expensive metaphors. And Menander may not have found it immediately convincing either, and this was surely not the only conversation they were said to have had. It is simply the one that survived in the record. And almost certainly, there was more to Menander's embrace of Buddhism than this single exchange. But that would be something mostly lost to history. But what the text tells us is, by the end of the dialogue, the king is convinced. He follows the same path Ashoka had taken decades earlier, seeking non-violence and turning away from conquest. He hands his kingdom to his son and takes up the life of a monk. How much of this is literally true is debatable, because the chronicle was shaped and expanded by Buddhist monks over generations. However, there is external confirmation that Menander was indeed remembered in sacred terms. The Greek writer Plutarch, with no Buddhist motive, says that when Menander died, his cities quarreled over his ashes and divided them among themselves to enshrine. That is strikingly close to the honor Buddhist tradition reserved for holy men. Plainly, the Buddhists counted him as one of their own. But the story does not end in a temple or a shrine. The most visible, radical transformation of this Greek-Buddhist alliance happened in the hands of the local artists. Before the Greeks arrived, early Buddhists never actually carved statues of the Buddha himself. He was considered too spiritually evolved to be trapped in human stone. Instead, Indian artists represented his presence through symbols: an empty throne, a footprint, a tree, or a wheel. But the Greeks were an artistic culture obsessed with the human form. For centuries, they had carved their gods like Apollo and Zeus out of marble, capturing perfect muscles, flowing hair, and realistic fabric. When the Greek-influenced artists of the Gandhara region began practicing Buddhism, they broke the ancient taboo. They decided to carve the Buddha. But they carved him using the only visual vocabulary they knew. Wavy hair tied in a top knot, robes that fall in deep folds like a Greek cloak, and the serene features of Apollo. And then, this figure traveled. It moved east along the Silk Road into China, Korea, and Japan. The face, the whole of Asia pictures when it thinks of Buddha, begins. Shaped by Greek art, Indian faith, and the crossroads between them.